You might think that the closest the Vikings were to moving out of Minnesota was during, say, one of their two stadium deals, but no, it was right in the middle. Let me tell you a story here on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. And of course, thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. Today on the show, I want to tell you a story about maybe the bleakest moment in Minnesota Vikings history. It's not the bleakest moment on the field. It happened in the mid-90s in the peak of the Vikings making the playoffs every year. Quarterback was Randall Cunningham. This was 1997. I want to tell you about the 1997 season. 98's the one that gets all the press, but the 97 season, I truly believe, saved the franchise. But to do that, you need about 15 years worth of context. So let's not waste any time. We've spoken quite a bit on this show as we've been doing a lot of history stuff about the older days of the Vikings. The reason for that, as you all now know, if you follow me on Twitter, is that I have been working tirelessly on a history documentary series, a 7-part series detailing in quite a bit of detail and quite a bit of storytelling flourish the history of the team. And so that research has spun into a number of podcasts. That's why we've been doing it this way this summer. And over the summer, we've talked a lot about Mike Lynn. How can't you? Mike Lynn is a very, we'll go with influential, to use a neutral term, figure in the Minnesota Vikings, of course, ultimately responsible for the Herschel Walker trade, the Les Steckel hire, and a few other things that ended up really harming the Vikings organization. How he got that job sort of tells you what Max Winter thought of him. Now, if you were listening to the Mike Lynn episode we did a couple of weeks ago, which you should listen to, you know that Max Winter kind of didn't trust him, Max Winter, founding owner. And a lot of that was because when Mike Lynn was first hired, it was as basically an administrative assistant. He had some experience with sports, but he was hired to help do stuff. Not to be a high level above the line decision maker. He was hired to do grunt work essentially. But around 83, 84, right when Bud Grant retired, kind of leaving this huge power vacuum in the Vikings, Mike Lynn took a couple of investors aside. And by the way, this is not the only corroboration I could find for this version of the story comes from Denny Green's book, No Room for Crybabies, which he published in the offseason right before the 97 season. We will talk about it more later, but he does tell this story of Mike Lynn pulling aside a couple of minority stakeholders in the Vikings and essentially putting them in his corner and sort of building this small coalition to pressure Max Winter into giving up his role as team president in 84 and then giving that to Mike Lynn. It's a succession style, hostile takeover of the team in a sense. It's savvy business sense, and that's how America works. But it doesn't seem like it was really, at least if you believe Denny Green's recalling of it, it doesn't seem like it was as much Max Winter's choice. But the drama far from ends there because Carl Pohlad and Erwin Jacobs, two of the more major stakeholders in the Vikings, did not like this. So here's how the Vikings ownership structure worked after Max Winter sold out his shares in, I think it was 88 in total, but he was kind of transitioning to this over years. So Here's how it worked. There were 10 principal owners. They each had a 9% stake, an equal 9% stake. And then the last 10% was divided up into smaller people that were basically just big investors in the team, but didn't have as much decision-making power. So it was this board of 10 people. Mike Lynn, as team president, with this coalition of investors, changed it to mean one guy, one vote. So instead of, I have 9% of the Vikings, I get 9% of the vote. Nope, now I'm just one person in the room, one vote, majority rules. And then, because Mike Lynn had a whole bunch of people in his pocket, he had kind of more votes than somebody who owned more of the team than he did. All of that means that in terms of like operational factors, in terms of like business finance decisions, Mike Lynn had a lot more power. And Jacobs and Pola did not like this, thought it was illegal. They had kind of an argument. The thing gets tied up in court for years. So all of this, of course, the NFL hates. The NFL is pressuring the Vikings this entire time to get one principal owner, one person who can be the guy. Show me your Jerry Jones. Show me your Art Rooney. And stop making us worry about the behavior of 10 people and all the bickering in the courts and all that stuff. It's a bad look for the NFL, and they want something cleaner and simpler. So remember that as we go through this, all that outside pressure is happening. Also, the decisions that this 10-person board makes are pretty bad after Mike Lynn leaves. So Mike Lynn goes away in like 1991. He gets a job promoting the World Football League, a minor league experiment that the NFL is working on. He doesn't last very long in that job, and that's kind of it for him in football. But that is so he leaves the Vikings, and that leaves this bickering board of 10 people, none of whom have any power. There's no final say. It's all just debate and gridlock. It's like Senate. And nothing ever gets done, and the decisions that do get done are just not going to be very efficient. The team's hemorrhaging money coming into this. And then Denny Green publishes an autobiography, and things get weirder from there. But before I dive into that, let me tell you about Grambling. BetOnline is your one-stop shop for all things Grambling. It's a great time to start getting your preseason bets down. As the preseason happens, lines might move. You might lose out on some edges. So you can bet on everything from win totals over unders. I think the Vikings are 8.5. So if you think the Vikings will have a winning season, go Gramble on it. If you don't, go Gramble on it. If you think they'll win the division, you can Gramble on it. If you think they will get third in particular, go Gramble on it. You can find all sorts of other sports too: golf, tennis, MMA, MLB, WNBA, whatever it is. You can bet on individual player props. You can bet in the middle of a game with their live betting apparatus. All sorts of great stuff. Go to betonline.net where the game starts. Who are the most influential players in the league? The superstars at Locked On NFL. They're going over a top 50 list yesterday on Locked On NFL. Ross and I went over numbers 31 through 40. Spoiler alert, 2 Vikings in there. And a Saint for Ross, but we got 2, so we win. So go check that out. As for us, I want to talk about how things were going for the Vikings leading up to the 97 season. So all that ownership drama in the late 80s and early 90s with Mike Lynn led to this weird political gridlock that just gummed the Vikings up. They were selling tickets. Denny Green had a good, fun team going. Headed into 1996, the Vikings on the field and the Vikings off the field were in very different situations. The 96 season was the 3rd season with Warren Moon as quarterback, and Warren Moon had played very well. They had some consistency issues. They had lost a playoff game. They didn't make the playoffs in 95, but just barely. And there were a lot of reasons to think that the Vikings could kind of take a step forward if they could get their consistency together. Sound familiar? But that was kind of the vibe surrounding the Vikings. Off the field and in terms of finances, they were in dire straits. They were making less money than every other team in the league, save the Jaguars and Panthers, who had literally just started as like organizations. So it was rough. Add to all that the stadium lease was coming up. So the Vikings were going to have to figure out what they wanted to do about the Metrodome. And the charm of the new stadium had sort of worn off. The ho hum, it's just a Midwestern place that's not really much. All that stuff had worn off. There was talk of maybe a new stadium again, even though the Metrodome was only 15 years old. There was talk of going back out to the suburbs or just extending the lease on the Metrodome would be the easy thing, but that's a business thing you have to work out, and it's a lot harder to work out when your finances are in the gutter, or moving. And these conversations were, I don't know how serious any conversation got, but it was absolutely an option. Where to move? There was talk of always Los Angeles. There was talk of San Antonio or Houston. Houston was really looking for a team at the time. They were losing, like in the process of losing the Oilers, so moving to Houston was a thing. There was, I think, a very interesting one was Birmingham. A YouTuber named Jaguar Gator 9, a Redditor named Jaguar Gator 9 who does YouTube videos. I've been around the block, okay? Did an awesome video on how the Vikings almost moved to Birmingham. Kind of going over a lot more of like the finances and stuff. But Birmingham had an interesting audience, and the World Football League had sort of shown Birmingham to be a very excited football watching population. People showed up to the games a lot, so they kind of were a market that people were interested in. There were a lot of options, and it was a convenient time to move. You might be changing owners. You're getting a lot of pressure from the NFL. Your finances suck. Your stadium sucks, and your lease is up on it. It was all kind of there. And when you're in that situation, the way to save the franchise is for the franchise to be exciting. And in 94, the franchise had Warren Moon, and that was really exciting. And then they went to a playoff game and got dusted. And then in 95, they didn't make the playoffs at all. So we've got a problem there, right? They're sort of in a very similar spot to where the Vikings are now. Like, they're kind of good, not great, and it's in like a really boring way. And there's not like, everybody on there has kind of been on there for a while, and there's this stagnant feel. All of that informs what happens in 1996, which is, once again, the Vikings make the playoffs and get dusted in the wild card round. They lose 45-10 to the Dallas Cowboys in a game where not only does Emmitt Smith run all over them, so does Herschel Walker at 37, I think he was in that game, back on the Cowboys after doing a little bit of a tour everywhere around. And he's dusting it's just like maximum pain at the end of 96. But there's one game in 96 that I want to talk to you about. It is in Oakland. So the Vikings had screamed out to a 5-1 record in 96, and they were exciting again. I mean, they were hanging, 30 points on people. They were winning everything. It was a very fun team, and the defense wasn't half bad. It seemed really interesting. And then they dropped 4 straight, and they suddenly were sitting at 5-5 after letting Seattle hang 40 on them in the Kingdome. They were sitting at 5-5 and with a trip to Oakland. And that's when the Lou Holtz thing happened. Now, you might remember around that time, Lou Holtz resigns from his post in the middle of the season at Notre Dame. Very weird thing to do, and he was being really cagey about why. It wasn't an age, it wasn't his time with family, it wasn't health or anything. Everything was really cagey, and people were like, is he angling at another job maybe? And then suddenly it comes out that he's angling at Minnesota, and that Minnesota has talked to him, and that, oh my God, they're going to fire Denny Green and bring in Lou Holtz. Lou Holtz might even finish coaching this season. Again, that sort of state of turmoil, that state of, newness, and we're in a period of transition. That's exactly when teams move, when there's something else that's going to happen. The LA Rams moved the year right before they fired Jeff Fisher. Kind of the vibe we're starting to get here. Now you're going to change coaches. You're going to have a weird stadium situation. You got your finances. You got all this stuff, pressure from the NFL. All of this stuff is really threatening the Vikings' foothold in Minnesota. And it's so hard to imagine the Vikings not being in Minnesota. I mean, they're Vikings. Look, we're used to it, right? We've been watching the Los Angeles Lakers for decades, but we can't go through this again, right? And just the Vikings not being a Minnesota team with their history of the Icemen and the cold and the whole wintry vibe that they have, it's just so unnatural. But it really was close. And I think going into this Oakland game, Denny Green was in real, genuine danger, and they win it in an exciting overtime. It's a chip shot kick, and the Vikings win this game, and you can really tell they were winning it for Denny Green. And they saved Denny Green's job just enough for them to rally, finish the season 9-7, make it into the playoffs. That playoff game is obviously a disaster. I talked about 45-10 is the final tally there. Dallas is, screams out into the real show of the playoffs. And making matters worse, 96 is the year that Brett Favre and the Packers win the Super Bowl. But they've at least shown enough to give Denny Green one last year. That year is 97. Now, in 97, in 96, Warren Moon had ankle issues, and Brad Johnson ended up finishing the season, and it was the Brad Johnson show. By middle of 97, Brad Johnson is benched, and Randall Cunningham comes in. Brad Johnson played most of the 97 season, but Randall Cunningham finished it, and that leads to a wild card playoff game in New York that's one of the most important ones the Vikings have ever played. Again, this is the year before 98, before the one we all remember, but 97, they were still in a lot of trouble. They were trying to figure out their ownership thing. They were still trying to get excitement. They had now had 5 years of Denny Green with no playoff wins, but 4 playoff appearances. We're flirting with Marvin Lewis things. And that brings us to the 1997 playoffs, and particularly the 1997 playoff game, and then what happened after truly changed the future of the entire Vikings organization. Vikings in the Meadowlands with everything on the line, they totally fall apart. Multiple fumbles, there's a dropped exchange, there's a botched snap, and before they know it, the Vikings are down 13-0, and they can't hold on to the ball. And look, this is the kind of thing where old memories start to creep into your mind. Oh my God, we got blown out 45-10 last year. We haven't really had a competitive game the last couple times we've been in the playoffs. We sort of always get here and fall apart. And look, we're falling apart again. A lot of it is Randall Cunningham with a ball security issue. At its worst, the Vikings were trailing in the third quarter 19-3. And then Tony Williams forces a Tiki Barber fumble that the Vikings pick up and return to point-blank range and easily cash in on the other side. Suddenly, 19-10 doesn't feel so bad, and the comeback is on. A couple of field goals later, we're looking at a 13-22 game, and in the fourth quarter, with 4-ish minutes to go, Randall Cunningham throws a bomb to Jake Reed for 30 yards and a score, and suddenly the Vikings are within 2. They need to get the onside kick, and by golly, they do. And they dink and dunk their way down to the 5-yard line of the New York Giants and plop in a 24-yard field goal to win 23-22 at the very end. The team is elated, and I think they knew what it meant. Because adding to all of this was No Room for Crybabies, the autobiography itself that Denny Green published in the offseason before the 1997 season, outing the Vikings over their whole Lou Holtz thing, describing how angry he was about that, talking about, some of it's like his life story and this outpouring of emotion and the support for all of his players and his journey to being a coach and all that stuff. There's a lot of talk about his experience being a black coach, and a lot of very insidious planning and not so veiled threats to try to buy the team. Remember, this ownership structure is a disaster to the NFL. They hate it, and Denny Green wants to come in and be the hero, be the first black owner. He's got all this ambition. So what he's going to do, this is a plan that he published and sold to the public, that he said out loud for everybody. Here's what I'll do. I'm going to draw up a lawsuit over breach of contract over this Lou Holtz thing. You weren't supposed to go talk to him, and that's a problem. And I'm going to threaten a lawsuit. And if you don't want me to sue, you'll let me buy your shares. And I'm going to get private investors to do that. He talked a lot about how one of the mistakes Mike Lynn made financially was when he purchased the parts of the team that he purchased, he did so on a bank loan. or Mike Lynn and like his investor group. They did so with bank loans, which meant the Vikings were actually paying interest on their profits for a long time, and that really hurt their finances. He said, no, we're going to do private investing, and so get rid of all that, and I'm going to buy a 30% stake in the team, and I'm going to be the head coach and owner. And I'm going to do it by threatening to sue you until you decide to give me. It's like I'm going to hostile take over the Vikings. And this is an acting coach who is pretty on the hot seat after losing in the playoffs 4 years in a row. And then he comes in and he finally wins that playoff game. It's exciting. They go to the divisional. They hang tough with the 49ers, who are, this is Steve Young, height of their power 49ers. Hang tough with them for a while, but it's ultimately not that close of a game. And then in the 1998 offseason, and I want to say like February of 98, or no, it was later. It was because it was after the draft. It was like August of 98. Red McCombs buys the team. And the bids flood in. After 97, this weird Denny Green plan immediately becomes impossible because people with a crap load of money start throwing that weight around. There's no way somebody like Denny Green could keep up. But it's guys like Glenn Taylor, which, I don't know, Wolves fans, tell me how you would have felt about that. There's Tom Clancy, very famously, was trying to buy the team. But Red McCombs is the one that came in and ultimately was able to put up the most money for the team. And what Red McCombs did, and this is a lukewarm defense of Red McCombs, but he balanced those books, and they needed Red McCombs. They needed someone cheap for a little bit, somebody who would actually prioritize the Vikings' finances and keep them from going under as an organization. He was able to get the fans re-involved and be high energy. He was able to be, the character, the like principal person that the NFL was looking for. So he got the NFL off their backs. He got the finances turned around. And of course, that was also 98. So there's all kinds of excitement. And now it's impossible to imagine the Vikings ever leaving Minnesota. And of course, we got a stadium everybody likes pretty well now, and hopefully they'll be in that one for decades and decades to come. But of course, at the end of the McCombs reign, around 2005, when he sells to the Wilfs, the I am prioritizing the finances thing had worn a little thin. And he wasn't hiring enough coaches, and there's all this a story for another day with Red McCombs. But I don't think it's exaggeration to say that Red McCombs saved the Vikings. And I don't think Red McCombs saves the Vikings if it isn't for that one win in Oakland in 96 that saves Denny Green's job and stops him from getting fired in the middle of the season, and the playoff win in 97 where the Vikings make a 16-point comeback in a quarter and change and totally re-energize the franchise and start to actually lure some bidders. There's a lot of drama in the mid-90s for the Vikings. And then, of course, it all gets totally overshadowed by what happens in 98. But lest we forget the heroics of people of yesteryear. I don't know what we'll do tomorrow on the show, but stories like that, it's the kind of thing you can find in the history documentary. I hope you go find it. More info on that will be out soon. I'll talk to y'all tomorrow. And as always, Skol.